Napoleon Bonaparte, probably the most famous man to ever have his picture taken on a horse, aroused one of two ideas in every single person he met: loyalty or hatred. A hero to the French people, and a thorn in the flesh of the European powers, who eventually defeated him. However, these European powers made a strange decision to not execute him, but to exile him. And today, we're gonna figure out why. Greatness from small beginnings. History is littered with great conquerors and leaders. Many of them have majestic beginnings. Alexander the Great was born to King Philip II of Macedon and had Aristotle as his personal tutor. Julius Caesar was born with a silver spoon and descended from a family of aristocrats. Great conquerors rarely came from relatively insignificant bloodlines, living on tiny islands. But hey, that's where our story begins. Sir Francis Drake had a motto: Sic parvis magna, translated to greatness from small beginnings. And no conqueror typifies this motto quite like Napoleon Bonaparte. In the early 18th century, the island of Corsica was part of the Republic of Genoa, and even proclaimed independence from them. On this tiny island, August 15th of 1769, the day of the Feast of Assumption, under the hot Mediterranean sun, was when Letizia and Carlo Bonaparte gave birth to their second child, Napoleon. He had younger siblings, Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jerome, as well as an older brother named Joseph. Born into a period of heated Corsican rebellion, Napoleon grew up with strong anti-French sentiments. Napoleon's father, Carlo, gave up on the fight for Corsican independence once French victory was assured. He betrayed his fellow rebels by refusing to fight in the mountains against the French army. This betrayal was something that Napoleon would never forgive his father for, viewing him as a traitor who had betrayed his fellow Corsicans. On the other hand, Napoleon adored his mother, Letizia. She was a stunning, strong-willed, and independent woman whom Carlo Bonaparte had married when she was just 14 years old. She had zero tolerance for nonsense. And even though she would punish Napoleon severely, he would later look back at the training he received from his mother and attribute all of his success in life to it. At the age of 16, Napoleon began his military apprenticeship as a sous-lieutenant, better known as a second lieutenant, training with the artillery of La Fère Regiment, which was the country's most elite artillery unit. Napoleon maintained his schooling while in the military, and he read a lot, especially works on strategy, tactics, and philosophy, most especially works by the two main intellectual juggernauts, Voltaire and Rousseau. He learned his trade very well, and he developed into a skilled handler of weaponry, as well as a leader of men. Napoleon wasn't content being some junior officer. He wanted to ascend through the ranks. Unfortunately for him, that'd be a little difficult. Positions were handed out on nobility, not talent, and also by height order. I know it's the joke that he's not actually as short as everyone says he is, but anyways. By his late teens, the young Napoleon felt stuck. He was in a state of maddening inertia. He knew that he was destined for great things, but nothing was happening. He was bored, but he needed something to happen, and what came next was absolutely perfect. Enter the French Revolution. 14th of July, 1789. Paris erupted in flames. A revolution was afoot. The Bastille was toppled, heads were chopped, monarchs were popped. But let's get something clear here. Executing a monarch was seen as a big taboo back then. So what happened during the French Revolution was nothing like Europe had ever seen at the time. Monarchs at the time were perceived as being ordained by a divine right to rule. So their execution was borderline blasphemous. The spark that untethered the revolution in all of its violence occurred when an angry mob took over an armory called Hôtel des Invalides, grabbed its weaponry, and stormed the Bastille prison. The purpose of the revolution and upheaval was to do away with the archaic social hierarchy and push for the equality of all French citizens. Despite his obligations as a French officer, Napoleon embraced the revolution, viewing it as a manifestation of the ideals he had come to believe in. After all, it was this very system that had prevented him from attaining the advancement of rank that he felt he was due. Still, he did his military duty and helped quench a riot in Auxonne just 8 days after the Bastille fell, arresting 33 people. He spent the first few years of the revolution fighting in Corsica against royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican patriots in a convoluted three-way conflict. He was intent on entering local politics in Corsica and rising through the ranks until he could proclaim his influence on the national stage. But the Corsican governor heavily opposed Napoleon, and Napoleon reacted by setting up a power base to oppose him. He attracted a following of young comrades, but the hand of the establishment proved to be too strong. He was forced to flee to the mountains and was declared a traitor and an enemy of his fatherland. Setting sail for France in June of 1793, Napoleon was tougher, hardened, and more formidable as a result of his terrible experience in his hometown of Corsica. That experience gave him a thorough reality check and a mental displacement. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a Corsican. Mentally, he was now a full-blooded French citizen, and now it was time to take control of France. The French Revolution temporarily concluded with the removal of the monarchy. We say temporarily because there's still more insurrection and riots coming our way. Whew, the French sure do love to riot. The country was rebranded as a republic, to be governed by an assembly known as the Convention. The incumbent king, Louis XVI, was guillotined in 1793, and the French monarchy monarchy collapsed with him. With the execution and dismantling of the monarchy, a series of massacres and numerous public executions took place in response to the revolutionary frenzy. The sheer disarray and pandemonium that aroused was a natural reaction to the execution of the king, Louis XVI. The murder of a figure as popular as the King of France was enough to destabilize the entire country and throw it right into chaos, which served as a precedent for the topic of this video, why future Emperor Napoleon, spoiler alert, was exiled and not executed. The revolution was a scary sight to see to other royalties of Europe. The crowned heads of Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia were truly terrified of the idea that the poor masses could easily take things into their own hands and lop off a few royal heads. The mayhem that ensued was popularly known as the Reign of Terror. It's estimated that around 300,000 suspects were arrested, and 17,000 people were executed during this time. It is during this tumultuous period that Napoleon began to gain fame. His rise to power and control was just getting started. Taking control of Toulon. His first major victory came when he defeated royalist forces supported by the British Navy at the port of Toulon. In the early days of the French Revolution, the city of Toulon, a naval port of the southern coast of France and home to around 28,000 people, had become a breeding ground for royalist ideas. The city had broken into open rebellion, and the citizens had thrown their port open to the British. It was the French artillery's job to prevent the British from gaining a stronghold on the city, and to subjugate the rebels. Napoleon knew that he had been presented with an opportunity of a lifetime. His destiny was in his own hands. Top aristocratic French officers had fled the country during the French Revolution, and there was a hole Napoleon was all too eager to fill. All he had to do was prove himself. In late September, Napoleon arrived on the scene with the French army and quickly set to work planning the attack. On arriving, he worked tirelessly, writing letters to nearby cities and towns to obtain guns, supplies, and ammunition. He blackmailed the recently rebellious towns around Marseille to give up their horses. He sent messages to Lyon, Grenoble, and even to the army of Italy and ordered that they send him unused cannons. He taught his gunners to man the arsenal and ammunition, and the infantry was rigorously trained under his direct supervision. He started to display the aura of a leader, which would shape a long-lasting allegiance within his ranks. This unbreakable loyalty, which he inspired in a lot of his troops, also played a factor in why the European powers couldn't execute him when they captured him. They knew that Napoleon's people loved him, and that they would run through a brick wall for him. If he got executed, you could be certain that men are going to retaliate. On December 17th of 1793, Napoleon gave the order to attack. His artillery opened fire on the forts, while his infantry advanced under cover of smoke and noise. The royalists fought fiercely, but they were overwhelmed by the French. Napoleon personally led the charge on Fort Mulgrave, the largest and most heavily fortified of the enemy lines. Napoleon led from the front. Unlike most commanders, he threw himself into combat and fought with fury in his eyes. His men fought their way up the hill, taking heavy casualties. An enemy bayonet slashed him in the thigh. Still, he continued. His forces quickly overcame the resistance. They managed to plant the French flag on the walls of the fort. The royalists, realizing that the battle was lost, set fire to the city and fled. The French captured nearly all of the enemy artillery and took thousands of prisoners. Within hours, 10 British ships had been destroyed, and those that remained were in retreat. It was a stunning and significant victory for Napoleon. It demonstrated the effectiveness of his tactics and solidified his reputation as a brilliant military commander, one which led to his promotion as brigadier general. Napoleon's showing off was one for the ages. The best way I could describe it is as General Jacques-François Dugommier put it at the siege. He said, "I have no words to describe Bonaparte's merit. Much technical skill, an equal degree of intelligence, and too much gallantry." The continental stage is set. The French Revolution caused surging ripples across the European landscape. It effectively challenged the existing order of European monarchies and led to a series of conflicts on the European stage. The revolutionary government in France was determined to spread its ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity across Europe, and it was met with resistance from the conservative powers of Europe, such as Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain. The French Revolutionary Wars broke out in 1792, and over the next decade, France was involved in a series of wars against a coalition of European powers, and Napoleon was in the front seat. This is known as the War of the First Coalition. Napoleon was given command of the French army in Italy, where he was trusted to take on France's enemies, the Austrians, along with their Italian allies. This was his first opportunity to fight on foreign soil, and he was determined to make the most of it. The campaign in Italy began in March of 1796, with Napoleon at the head of the army of Italy. His mission was to drive the Austrians out of Italy, and he achieved this by employing a combination of speed, the element of surprise, and maneuver. The first significant battle of the campaign was at Montonet, where Napoleon outflanked and defeated the Austrian army. This was another defining moment in his military career where he demonstrated his genius as a commander. He then went on to win a series of battles at Melissimo, Dego, and Mondovi. securing control of the region of Piedmont. After consolidating his position in Piedmont, Napoleon turned his attention to the Austrian army in the east. Two armies met at the famous Battle of Lodi, where Napoleon was right in the heat of battle, aiming and firing at the cannons himself and getting covered in mud and sand. Again, this earned him the total respect of his men. In fact, they respected him so much that when he instructed for an almost suicidal assault on the only bridge in town, they charged at it, and they took it despite fierce Austrian resistance. Napoleon's use of artillery and his famous crossing of the bridge under enemy fire led to a decisive victory. This battle allowed the French army to cross the River Po and advance deeper into Italy, pursuing the army across the Alps, through the treacherous terrain of the Apennines. He eventually caught up with the Austrians at the Battle of Rivoli, where he utilized a combination of infantry and cavalry charges to defeat the Austrian army. This victory secured French control of northern Italy. Napoleon's conquest of northern Italy led to the creation of sister republics, namely the Cisalpine Republic and the Ligurian Republic, both of which were modeled on the French Republic and represented a significant departure from the traditional political structures of the region. The Austrians signed the Treaty of Campo Formio, and this ended the War of the First Coalition. Just a year later, the War of the Second Coalition was about to start. Britain and Russia still wanted to contain the expansion of the French Republic and restore the monarchy in France, whereas Austria, still weakened and in debt from the War of the First Coalition, sought to recover its position and come out stronger than it entered. The next location for battle was North Africa, specifically Egypt. The 28-year-old French general had his sights set on conquering Egypt in 1798. His plan was to establish a French presence in the country, undermine British access to India, and ultimately increase his own power and prestige. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt was off to a great start. His troops, well-equipped, well-trained, made quick work of the Egyptian army, which was poorly organized and poorly armed. The French marched inland, capturing the cities of Cairo and Giza and securing the Nile River. However, Napoleon soon found himself facing unexpected challenges. His supply lines were stretched thin, and his troops suffered from the harsh desert climate and diseases such as dysentery and malaria. The natives, initially welcoming of the French, grew very resentful of their presence as the occupation continued. In addition, the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, arrived at the Mediterranean and began disrupting French supply ships and captured or destroyed all but two vessels of the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile. Coupled with the lack of control in Egypt, Bonaparte also received news that the political situation in France was extremely fragile. He decided to abandon his campaign in Egypt and return home. On the night of the 22nd of August of 1799, Bonaparte left Egypt in secret to avoid upsetting his soldiers. After a few months at sea, he arrived in France. Though he failed to bring Egypt under control, Napoleon was greeted as a hero upon his return to Paris on October 9th of 1799. Upon his arrival, Napoleon met a nation in turmoil. Rise to power. The government was bankrupt and growing increasingly unpopular with the French population at the time. External forces complicated the situation as the Austrians and the Russians were threatening to invade. Some people even wanted to bring back the royal family. With the country in chaos, this was Napoleon's platform to rise. Napoleon was then approached by a very influential politician, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who said he wanted to stage a coup against the deeply unpopular government and needed the extremely popular Napoleon's help. With the people and the army behind him, Napoleon took charge of the Grand Assembly, and they overthrew the directory by a coup d'etat, which would come to be known as the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire, installing a new government that was to be headed by the three provisional consuls, him, Sieyès, and his own brother Lucien Bonaparte. But after Napoleon did some rewriting of the constitution, in the end, there was really only one man in charge, the first consul, him, while the other two consuls had consultative voices only. This constitution preserved the appearance of a republic, but in reality, France was under a dictatorship. At 30 years of age, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen from his humble Corsican background to become the most powerful man in France. Napoleon inherited a weary and disillusioned nation that had limped from one failed monarchy to another. The people looked to Napoleon to save them from their despair, but firstly, he had to save them from the Austrians. Yes, the Austrians were back for a rematch. They had regrouped and gained back most of the land that Napoleon had secured during his Italian campaign. In proper Napoleon fashion, he decided to take the offensive. In the spring of 1800, he took his strongest men and marched across the French Alps. He and his men traversed snow-covered mountain ranges, which towered to a height of 10,500 feet. They eventually made the crossing in just 6 days, and the Austrians met Napoleon head-on at the Battle of Marengo. Initially, the Austrians had a numerical advantage, fielding about 30,000 Australian soldiers, with Napoleon commanding 24,000 French troops. The Austrians' initial attack surprised the French and gradually drove them back. The Austrian general stated that he had won the battle and retired to his headquarters around 3 p.m., leaving his subordinates in charge of pursuing the French. During their tactical retreat, the French army never broke their lines. Napoleon urged his troops to stand and fight. Later in the afternoon, a full French division arrived in the field and reversed the tide of battle. A series of artillery barrages and cavalry charges absolutely decimated the Austrian army, leaving behind 14,000 casualties. Napoleon had won again. The Austrians withdrew and, early the following year, signed a peace treaty with Napoleon, just like the War of the First Coalition. The Second Coalition ended in another French victory. On December 2nd of 1804, Napoleon had himself crowned as the first Emperor of the French. In a lavish ceremony at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, the Pope was even invited to attend. And normally, he would be the one to crown an emperor. But to make sure everyone knew that he was the one in charge here, Napoleon lifted the crown and placed it upon his own head. Long live the emperor. Period of peace. After a decade of constant warfare, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens in March of 1802, bringing the Revolutionary Wars to an end and returning peace to the entirety of Europe. You see, through the chaotic French Revolution, the French government struggled to keep the economy afloat. Napoleon could conquer, but the current question was, could Napoleon govern? The answer was yes. Napoleon introduced several economic and political reforms that had far-reaching effects on France and Europe. These reforms were aimed at strengthening the French economy, consolidating political power, and promoting a sense of national unity amongst the French people. Napoleon's popularity in France was at an all-time high. After bringing much-needed stability to France, he was perceived by the common people as a liberator of the masses. As I said previously, you're either incredibly loyal to Napoleon, or you have a deep hatred for him. There's no in-betweens. Any foreign power who tried to overthrow or execute their precious emperor will be met with mass uprising and revolt. One of the most significant economic reforms introduced by Napoleon was the establishment of the Bank of France in 1800. The Bank of France was modeled after the Bank of England and was tasked with issuing paper money, stabilizing the economy, and regulating the money supply. This move helped to stabilize the French economy and gave the government greater control over the financial system. Napoleon also reformed the French tax system, introducing a more efficient and equitable tax code that helped to increase revenue and reduce corruption. He abolished many of the feudal privileges and taxes that had burdened the French peasantry and established a system of indirect taxation that placed a greater burden on the wealthy. Ooh, my boys, they surely didn't like that. And in addition to his economic reforms, Napoleon also introduced significant political reforms during his period of temporary peace. One of the most notable reforms was the establishment of the Napoleonic Code in 1804. The Napoleonic Code was a comprehensive legal code that replaced the complex and often contradictory legal system that had existed in France prior to Napoleon's reign. The Napoleonic Code provided a uniform set of laws that applied to all citizens, regardless of their social status or region of origin. With regard to religion, the revolution had pretty much abolished the Catholic Church. But Napoleon understood that many French citizens still consider themselves Catholic. So he came to an agreement with the Pope and he brought back the church. Only this time, it would come back with some pretty hefty power checks and balances. He ensured freedom for other religions and was often cited for his positive treatment of Jewish people at a time of widespread anti-Semitism. Despite these reforms, Napoleon's rule was marked by authoritarianism and suppression of political opposition. He often relied on censorship and propaganda to maintain his grip on power. The general's greatest victory. Before Napoleon had even declared himself emperor, the British redeclared war on France, because both sides had been violating their previous treaty. Napoleon gathered his troops along the English Channel, but here was the issue. Napoleon's powerful army would almost certainly decimate the British on land. There was very little chance they'd actually make it across the Channel because the British were the master of the seas. This power dynamic would prevent the two enemies from engaging in much real, direct combat. The British went ahead to assemble the Third Coalition with Austria, Russia, Naples, and Sweden, hoping to put Napoleon back in his place. This coalition forces thought that they had a good chance against Napoleon. I mean, it's 5 versus 1, right? But what they weren't ready for was Napoleon's big brain. This was peak Napoleon at his most masterful, enlightening best. What separated Napoleon's army from others was their sheer speed. He had reorganized his army into corps, which were basically smaller armies of their own. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and as a result, they were able to act more independently and faster. Part of the coalition's plan was for the Russians to meet up with the Austrians and take on Napoleon together. Combined, they could turn the tide against him. So, Napoleon's current objective was to stop them from ever meeting. And in a matter of weeks, Napoleon marched 200,000 men secretly across France, encircling the Austrian general and capturing his entire army. Napoleon later stated, "I have destroyed the Austrian army simply by marching." This victory was soured by the word that British Admiral Nelson had engaged his fleet at Trafalgar, successfully punching through Napoleon's allied Franco-Spanish naval line. This British victory ensured their control of the sea, and the death of Admiral Nelson during the battle made him a legend. Napoleon's hopes for a future British invasion were dashed away. So, Napoleon set his sights on the Russians, but they began to retreat with Napoleon giving chase. The idea was that the longer it took for Napoleon to capture the Russians, the more time it gave for the other members of the coalition to mobilize. He deliberately abandoned a strategic position near the town town of Austerlitz in the Austrian Empire so that his army, which numbered around 68,000, would appear weak. They would seem like an easy target. He then weakened his right flank as to lure the 90,000-strong foe into a trap. They left their center open to counterattack, and Napoleon would launch a huge central assault up the hill. Napoleon absolutely crushed the Allies. As the retreating men attempted to flee across the frozen lakes, Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire down upon the ice, causing an unknown number to just drown. The Battle of Austerlitz was over. This was Napoleon's masterpiece.
He later went on to say, "The Battle of Austerlitz is the finest of all I have fought."
Then, with the French conquest of Naples in 1806, the War of the Third Coalition ended as yet another Napoleon victory. But one European nation remained to be brought to heel: Russia. Beginning of the end. With the implementation of the so-called continental system of European port blockades against British trade beginning in 1806, Napoleon attempted to engage in extensive economic warfare against Britain. Following Napoleon's victory over the Russians at Friedland in Prussia in 1807, Alexander I was compelled to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, a peace agreement. However, in 1810, Russia left the continental system after growing increasingly tired of Napoleon's deceit and cunningness. Napoleon led a sizable army into Russia in the summer of 1812 as revenge. The Russians chose a tactic of systematically retreating and scorching the earth anytime Napoleon's armies attempted to strike, rather than fighting the French in a full-scale battle. Napoleon's men therefore ventured deeper into Russia, despite being ill-equipped for a protracted conflict. The bloody Battle of Borodino in September resulted in significant deaths on both sides. While Napoleon's army arrived in Moscow, they had discovered that practically the entire population had just left. To cut off the enemy troops' supply lines, retreating Russians started fires all throughout the city. Napoleon was compelled to order his starved, worn-out army out of Moscow after waiting for a month for capitulation that never materialized. This was because the Russian winter had begun. His army had continuously been harassed by an unexpectedly aggressive and ruthless Russian force during the tragic withdrawal. Only about 100,000 of Napoleon's initial 600,000 soldiers who started the battle actually made it out of Russia. It was a blow from which the little general would never recover. This setback was followed in 1813 by the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, in which a coalition of Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and Swedish armies destroyed Napoleon's soldiers. Following his withdrawal to France, Allied armies conquered Paris in March of 1814. Napoleon escaped only to find hostility back in Paris. The Legislative Assembly, the Senate, and even his own generals turned on him. He had no choice but to abdicate, which he did on April 6 of 1840. It was agreed to exile Napoleon to the Mediterranean island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. It was decided that the old Bourbon monarchy would be restored. King Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, would become the King of France. But Napoleon was once the conqueror of Europe. He had lived a life of adventure, renown, and prestige. Now, he found himself lonely on a tiny island in the Mediterranean, and he was bored. He thought maybe he could somehow return to France and reclaim his throne, so he put his thoughts into action. His escape wasn't flashy. He basically had a leaving ceremony, hopped on a ship, and sailed back to France with 1,000 men. As Napoleon continued his journey to Paris, the king sent battalions of men to stop him, but they largely comprised Napoleon's old soldiers, many unhappy with King Louis's reforms. And so, when ordered to arrest him, they simply couldn't do it. In one famous incident, the troops began to cry out, "Long live the Emperor!" By the time Napoleon rode into Paris, Louis XVIII had fled. Napoleon was back in command, and the people welcomed him as a redeemed hero. Why Napoleon was exiled and not executed? The Allied leaders were having none of it. They were in utter shock and disbelief that the devil had been let loose. They immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and an illegitimate ruler of France. Then they declared war, not on France, but on Napoleon himself. They began making plans to combine their forces and once again invade France. But the most immediate threat to Napoleon was the British and Prussians situated in nearby Belgium. Together, the two armies in the north outnumbered him, so he made a plan to divide them and take them on separately. A plan which had served him so well over the years. The Great Reckoning was at hand, and it would be delivered on a field outside of a small Belgian town called Waterloo. On the 18th of June, he marched north with his men and confronted the Allies in a number of initial engagements, defeating the Prussians before turning to take on the British. But poor communication, tactics, and hesitation amongst his marshals allowed both enemy armies to retreat, and crucially, rather than fleeing east, the Prussians moved north where they could remain in contact with the British. The French marshals launched a number of miscalculated cavalry charges at the British lines. The British formed defensive formations, and they tore the cavalry to shreds. The French lines panicked and they began to flee. Battle of Waterloo was an Allied victory. 4 days later, the British had a hold of him, and they had to decide what did they want to do with him. Letting him go free in the United States carried the danger of another triumphant return. He had already been exiled to the island of Elba, from which he escaped, so that seemed like a bad idea. The only other option was to execute him, right? Well, no, they decided to exile Napoleon again, almost as if they didn't learn their lesson the first time. But there was a reason why he was exiled and not executed. Politically speaking, it would have been suicidal for the Allies. The English once executed the monarch, Charles I, and and that turned out to be a horrible disaster for them. The memories of the French Revolution were also fresh, and all the chaos that it brought about. Napoleon was extremely popular in France, and there was no way the French would have forgiven the coalition for executing Napoleon. The dreams for a balance of power on the continent would never occur if he was executed. The multiple reasons why Napoleon was not executed have been sprinkled throughout this video, but a quick summary would be done.
Firstly, Napoleon was exiled because the execution of monarchs was forbidden.
Exile was the most common form of punishment for people of noble birth since the Middle Ages because it avoided the sticky issues of having to kill someone important. The idea that anyone could just come in and kill a leader who supposedly has a divine right to rule ordained by God could lead to the idea that your own monarch is someone who could be killed. The Pope himself was present when Napoleon was crowned as the emperor, which gave a divine blessing to his right to rule. Secondly, it was to avoid martyrdom. Executing someone with a particularly high level of influence could, in return, galvanize a resistance movement. Thirdly, the head of the great powers and the leaders of the Congress of Vienna didn't want to set a dangerous precedent and make an example of the execution of monarchs, mainly because the great powers themselves were still using the monarchical system. The most recent execution of a head of state were Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and the last thing the concert of Europe wanted was another French Revolution. So, as just shown by the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon still had many allies and supporters in France, and his death may have incited the rebellion. So he was packed off to the remote British colony of St. Helena. At 46, the man who was on top of the world was a man without a future. The man of undying ambition. The man of action was confined to his personal space, performing trivial activities. He died on May 5th, 1821, likely from stomach cancer at the age of 51. If this video happened to make you curious about the history of Europe and the world at large, check out our other awesome videos on the channel.